The desert was merciless. The sun hung high like a burning coin hammered against the endless sky, and beneath its fury walked a woman whose steps faltered with every mile. Her dress was torn and coated in dust, her face hollow with thirst, and in her arms she carried a boy no older than 6. His small head rested limply against her shoulder, his lips cracked and his breath shallow. For 2 days they had wandered across this barren land, and with each sunrise her hope had thinned like smoke caught in the wind. The sand stretched endlessly, glowing in the blistering heat. The mother's eyes, red and raw from the sun's glare, searched the horizon as if begging the earth itself to reveal some scrap of water, some shadow of mercy. But the world remained silent, a graveyard of silence and heat. She whispered to her child, not to comfort him but to keep herself from collapsing into madness. "Hold on, my sweet boy," she murmured, though her voice was broken. "Just a little more. Mama's here. Mama won't leave you." But even as she spoke, doubt gnawed at her heart. Her lips were so dry they bled when she moved them. Her body swayed as though every bone had turned to sand, and the boy's feeble cries had long since faded into silence. By the end of the first day, she had torn a strip of cloth from her skirt to shield his face from the sun. By the second, she had no strength left even for that. The weight of despair. She sank to her knees in the burning sand, the child sliding gently into her lap. Her arms trembled from exhaustion, but she cradled him, as if she could shield him from death itself. A vulture circled far above, black wings against the blinding sky, waiting. Tears tried to rise in her eyes, but her body was too dry to spare them. She wanted to scream at the heavens, to demand why they had been abandoned, why no one had come for them. Instead, only a ragged breath escaped. "This is it," she whispered. "This is how it ends." She thought of the small cabin they had once lived in, the laughter of her boy before hunger took away his smile, the promises she had made to protect him. Each memory pressed down like a stone on her chest. Her head bowed forward, shadows beginning to blur her vision. Just one moment of rest, she told herself. Just one moment to close her eyes. A sound in the silence. At first, she thought it was her mind playing tricks on her. A faint sound, distant and rhythmic, cutting through the stillness of the desert. She forced her eyes open, blinking through. The haze of heat rising from the ground. Hooves. The steady drumming grew louder, closer. She squinted toward the horizon, half certain it was only a mirage, like the pools of water she had imagined before, only to find more sand waiting. But no, a figure was moving toward her. A horse, its mane whipping with each stride, and upon it a man. Her body refused to believe it. She wanted to call out, but her voice was only a dry rasp. The world wavered before her eyes, the line between life and illusion thin as glass. The rider drew closer, his silhouette dark against the molten light. A wide-brimmed hat shaded his face, and a long coat trailed behind him. He slowed as he neared, scanning the ground, until his eyes fell upon the woman and her child. The horse snorted, pawing at the earth. The man dismounted in one swift motion, his boots sinking into the sand. The whisper of salvation. The woman tried to speak, tried to rise, but her strength was gone. The child stirred weakly in her arms, letting out a faint whimper. The cowboy knelt beside them. He carried no trace of hesitation, only a calmness that felt almost foreign in the brutal desert. From his saddlebag he drew a canteen, unscrewed the cap, and held it gently to the woman's lips. The first drop of water was fire, burning down her cracked throat. The second was relief so sharp it made her eyes sting. He pressed the canteen to her boy's mouth, tilting it carefully until the child's lips moved. "You're not alone," the cowboy said softly. His voice was deep, steady, as if it carried weight enough to anchor her against the storm of despair. For a moment, The woman thought she might break. After 2 days of silence, of carrying the weight of death on her shoulders, those 3 words shattered something inside her. She clutched her child tighter, sobs clawing at her chest, though her body was too dry to release them. The cowboy didn't press her for words. He only placed a steady hand on her shoulder, letting her feel the weight of his presence. Hope in the dust. He carried the boy onto his horse, wrapping him in a blanket pulled from his pack. Then, with strength that seemed effortless, he lifted, the woman too, seating her behind him. The desert stretched endlessly around them, but for the first time in 2 days, she no longer saw only death. She saw a chance. The horse surged forward, its hooves striking against the earth. Wind brushed against her face, cooling the fire of the sun just enough for her lungs to draw deeper breaths. Her head rested lightly against the cowboy's back, her eyes closing not from despair this time, but from the fragile peace of knowing someone had come, and as the horse carried them toward the horizon, she whispered a prayer. Not of desperation, but of gratitude. For in her darkest hour, when she had been certain the desert would claim her and her child, a voice had broken through the silence, steady and sure. You're not alone. As the horse carried them across the endless desert, the woman's head rested weakly against the cowboy's back. The rhythm of hooves was steady, but her thoughts wandered to the road that had brought her here, to the suffering, the loneliness, the choices that had torn her world apart. Not long ago, she had lived in a wooden cabin by a river bend. It wasn't much, but it had been home. Her husband, a lumberman with rough hands and a gentle smile, had once filled the place with laughter. But sickness had come like a thief in the night, stealing him before the boy was even old enough to remember his face. Left alone, she worked every odd job the town allowed a widow, washing, mending, hauling water. Yet poverty tightened its grip like a noose. Neighbors who once offered pity turned cold, whispering behind her back. And when debts mounted, the landlord's patience crumbled. She had begged for time, begged for mercy, but none came. And so she had fled with her child, clutching what little she owned. The desert had seemed like a passage toward freedom, but instead, it had become a prison of sand and sun. And now, if not for the stranger who had appeared on horseback, it might have been her grave. The cowboy's silence. The man who carried her said little. His broad shoulders moved with the horse's rhythm, his hat casting a shadow across his weathered face. He guided the reins with steady hands, every motion practiced, precise. She wanted to ask him who he was, why he had been riding alone through this barren land, but exhaustion chained her tongue, and something about his silence told her he carried his own burdens, stories carved into him like scars, too heavy to share with a stranger. Still, his actions spoke. The way he adjusted the blanket around her boy when the wind grew colder. The way he checked the canteen, rationing water so carefully it was clear he had been traveling long enough to know how cruel the desert could be. There was a hardness about him, but beneath it, a strange kind of gentleness. Nightfall in the desert by. The time the sun dipped behind the jagged horizon, painting the sky in streaks of crimson and gold. The woman stirred. Her body trembled from exhaustion, but she forced her eyes open. They had stopped near a cluster of rocks where the cowboy had tethered his horse. A small fire crackled, its light dancing in the growing darkness. The scent of beans and coffee lingered in the air. Simple food, but to her, it smelled like salvation. The boy lay wrapped in a blanket, already asleep, his small chest rising and falling with newfound strength. The cowboy sat nearby, pouring black coffee into a tin cup, his face unreadable in the firelight. When he noticed her stirring, he handed her a piece of bread without a word. She took it, hands trembling, and ate slowly, each bite bringing life back into her veins. Finally, she whispered, "Why did you stop for us?" The cowboy's gaze lingered on the fire. "Because no one should die alone out here." His tone was simple, but his eyes betrayed something deeper, a memory, a wound. The weight. He carried, she didn't press him, but later, when the fire had burned low and the desert wind howled through the rocks, he spoke again, almost to himself. "Years back," he said slowly, "I had a wife. We were crossing land like this, chasing a dream. Thought we'd find a place where the soil was rich, where we could build something worth keeping." His jaw tightened. "But the desert don't forgive mistakes. Water ran out. Supplies, too. I couldn't save her." Silence stretched. The woman's breath caught. She understood now. Why his eyes carried so much sorrow. Why he had turned his horse the moment he saw her and the boy. "Not this time," he murmured, almost like a vow. "Not again." The journey forward. The next morning they set off early. The boy was stronger, though still weak, his small hands clutching at his mother's dress as they rode. The cowboy scanned the horizon with sharp eyes, reading the land as if it were a book only he understood. Twice, he led them off course to find water, once at a shallow well hidden by brush, another time at a trickling stream that seemed like a miracle. Each time he let the woman and child drink first, before he touched a drop himself. But the desert was not done testing them. A sandstorm rose on the second day, sweeping across the flats like a beast made of dust and rage. The horse bucked against. "The wind!" the boy cried out, and the woman clung desperately to the saddle. The cowboy pulled them through, guiding the horse to shelter among stone cliffs. His face was streaked with grit, his hat nearly torn away, but his grip never faltered. When the storm finally passed, they were battered, but alive. A town divided at. Last, after 3 days' ride, the faint outline of a town appeared in the distance. Wooden rooftops, a water tower, and the promise of safety. The woman's heart leapt, but when they arrived, not all welcomed them. Townsfolk gathered, whispering as the cowboy carried the boy into the doctor's office. Some saw only a destitute widow, a burden. Others sneered at her ragged clothes and the dirt of the desert clinging to her skin. But when they learned what had happened, how she had wandered 2 days in the scorching sun, how the cowboy had saved them, shame spread through their murmurs. For while they had turned her away before, leaving her to starve, a stranger had done what they would not. The final whisper. That night, as the boy rested safe in a clean bed, the woman stepped outside the doctor's porch. The cowboy was already there, saddling his horse, the moon casting silver across his figure. "You're leaving," she said softly. He adjusted the reins, not meeting her eyes, was just passing through, still got a long road ahead. She wanted to thank him, to tell him what his presence had meant, but her throat tightened. Before she could speak, he tipped his hat, and in that same steady voice that had pulled her back from despair, he whispered once more, "You're not alone." And with that, he rode into the night, a shadow against the endless horizon, a man haunted by his past, but who had given her and her child the one thing the desert could not take: hope. The desert stretched endlessly, a sea of shifting sand and blinding light. Heat shimmered above the ground, warping the horizon into mirages of water that vanished the moment she reached for them. For 2 days, the woman trudged forward with her child clinging to her skirts, each step heavier than the last. The boy's lips were cracked, his skin pale beneath the unforgiving sun. He no longer asked for food. He no longer cried. That silence terrified her more than the hunger itself. Her legs buckled. She dropped to her knees, clutching the child to her chest. Around them, vultures circled in lazy arcs, waiting. The desert was cruel. It took without mercy. And soon she feared it would take them too. She closed her eyes, whispering prayers to a God she no longer knew if she believed in. Just let someone find us. Just one person. A shadow appears. The sound of hooves broke through the silence. Distant. At first, then louder. She blinked against the sun, wondering if it was another mirage. But no. A figure on horseback approached, a dark silhouette cutting across the golden light. The rider slowed as he drew near. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face hidden beneath the brim of a dust-worn hat. A rifle was strapped across his saddle, a coil of rope at his side. Every inch of him spoke of the hard roads he had traveled, the kind of man shaped by both violence and solitude. The woman wanted to speak, to call out, but her throat was too dry. She only clutched her child tighter, as if afraid this stranger might take him away. The cowboy swung down from his horse in one smooth motion. His boots crunched against the sand. For a moment he said nothing, only studied her with sharp eyes that seemed to weigh the truth of her suffering. Then, in a voice low and steady, he said the words she had been desperate to hear. "You're not alone. A fragile rescue." He gave her water first, slow sips from his canteen, careful not to overwhelm her parched body. Then he pressed a small piece of jerky to her boy's lips, coaxing him to chew. The child stirred weakly, the first sign of life in hours. The woman's tears fell silently. She had been on the edge of despair, ready to surrender to the desert. But this man, this stranger, had pulled her back. "You'll ride with me," he said simply, helping her onto his horse. His arms were strong as he lifted the boy, wrapping him in a blanket before settling them both against the saddle. As the horse began to move, she glanced back at the wasteland they had left behind. 2 days of torment, 2 days of hopeless wandering. Now, for the first time, there was a chance of survival. The cowboy's burden. He spoke little as they rode. His focus was on the horizon, eyes scanning for danger, ears tuned to the wind. But his silence was not cold. It was the silence of a man who had known suffering too well, who carried stories too heavy to share easily. She studied him quietly. His hands were scarred, his face weathered by sun and time. There was something haunted in his gaze, as though he had seen too many graves dug beneath desert skies. Once, when the boy stirred and whimpered, the cowboy reached back, steadying the child with surprising gentleness. For all his rough exterior, there was kindness hidden in him, the kind born not of softness but of loss. Firelight, confessions. That night they camped beneath the stars. The cowboy built a small fire, the flames crackling against the chill that came with nightfall. He offered them beans from a tin, bread hardened by the trail. To the woman and her boy, it tasted better than any feast. When the child slept, she finally found her voice. "Why help us? You don't even know our names." The cowboy stared into the fire, his jaw tight. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said quietly, "Because once, someone needed me, and I wasn't there." She didn't ask more. The pain in his tone told her everything. Whoever she had been, wife, sister, child, she was gone, and the memory of failing her was carved into his soul. The storm. The next day, the desert tested them again. Winds rose without warning, carrying sand in a furious storm that swallowed the sky. The horse reared, the boy screamed, and the woman clung desperately to the saddle. The cowboy fought to keep control, his hat torn away, his face whipped raw by grit. But his grip was unshakable, his voice steady as he shouted above the storm, "Hold on! Don't let go!" He guided them to the shelter of a rocky outcrop, shielding them with his own body until the winds passed. When the silence returned, they were bruised, exhausted, but alive. For the woman, it was proof. This man would not abandon them. No matter what the desert threw their way, he would stand between them and death. The town's judgment by the third. Day. The outline of a town rose on the horizon. To the woman it looked like salvation. But as they rode down its dusty main street, faces turned coldly toward them. Some townsfolk whispered, calling her a burden, a beggar, a woman who had brought misfortune on herself. Others sneered at the cowboy, muttering about why a man like him would trouble himself with a widow and her half-dead child. Yet when the doctor examined the boy and declared he would live, shame spread through their voices. They had ignored her once, left her to the mercy of the desert. A stranger had shown more compassion than all of them combined. The parting. That night, as her child slept safe in a warm bed, she stepped outside to find the cowboy saddling his horse. "You're leaving," she said softly. He adjusted the reins, not meeting her eyes. "Was just passing through. Never planned to stay." She wanted to beg him to remain, to thank him for saving their lives. But her words caught in her throat. She could only watch as he swung into the saddle. Before he turned to ride, he paused, tipping his hat. His voice was the same low murmur that had pulled her back from despair on that first day. "You're not alone." And then he was gone, swallowed by the night. The desert was not meant for survival. For 2 endless days, the woman staggered beneath the merciless sun, her child pressed weakly against her chest. Their lips were cracked, their skin burned. Every step felt like a betrayal of her body, a punishment for daring to hope. The child's whimper had long since turned into silence, a silence more terrifying than any cry. She whispered stories into his ear, stories of rivers and bread, of shade and safety. But her own voice grew faint, swallowed by the wind. When she stumbled, her knees struck the sand, hot enough to blister. She pressed her child close, shielding him from the cruel ground. All around them the desert stretched into nothing. No trees, no water, no sign of life, only vultures circling above, their wings casting fleeting shadows over her agony. Her mind told her to stop, to surrender. But her heart, a mother's heart, refused. She dragged herself forward inch by inch, clinging to the fragile thread of life that bound her and her boy. The distant rider by the second nightfall, she was sure they would die. She lay in the sand, arms wrapped protectively around her child. Stars burned above them, sharp and cold, while the desert whispered with unseen dangers. Her eyes fluttered shut. That was when the sound came. Hooves, steady, rhythmic, growing louder. At first she thought it was her imagination, the cruel tricks of exhaustion. But then she saw it, a figure on horseback, emerging from the night as if carved from shadow and starlight. The rider slowed when he saw her. He sat tall in the saddle, shoulders broad beneath a dust-stained coat. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but the glint of steel caught the fire of the stars, a rifle strapped to his horse. He was a man of the wild, accustomed to danger, forged by solitude. The woman tried to speak, but her voice was broken. She could only raise a trembling hand, pleading without words. The horse stopped. The cowboy dismounted with a heavy thud, his boots sinking into the sand. For a long moment, he simply stood there, watching her. Then his voice, deep, calm, unshakable, cut through the silence. "You're not alone." The first gift, he knelt beside her, uncorking his canteen. "Easy now," he said as he lifted her head, pressing the water to her cracked lips. She drank greedily, but he pulled it back. "Slow. Too much'll hurt you." He turned to the boy, coaxing drops of water into his mouth. Then he tore a strip of jerky, softening it between his own teeth before pressing it gently to the child's lips. The boy stirred, weak but alive. The woman wept silently. She wanted to thank him, but no words would come. The cowboy didn't ask for gratitude. He only studied her with sharp eyes, measuring the depth of her suffering, and then he said, "You'll ride with me." He lifted her as though she weighed nothing, setting her in the saddle. Then he wrapped her child in his coat, tucking him close against her. With one strong pull, he mounted behind them, guiding the horse forward into the unknown night. The road of silence. They traveled for hours. The horse's hooves drummed steadily against the earth, a sound that seemed to push back the silence of death. The woman leaned against the cowboy, her body weak but her spirit clinging to the warmth of his presence. He didn't speak much. His silence was heavy, not the silence of indifference, but of a man used to keeping his pain buried deep. Yet there was something steady in him, something unshakable. She knew without words that he would not abandon them. At dawn, she opened, her eyes to see his profile against the rising sun. His face was weathered, lined with the hard years of a man who had seen too much. Yet when he glanced down at the boy sleeping against her chest, his expression softened, a fleeting glimpse of tenderness that revealed the man beneath the steel. A camp, beneath the stars. That night, they stopped near a cluster of rocks where the wind was less cruel. The cowboy built a small fire, coaxing flames from dry twigs. He handed her a tin of beans, a piece of bread hard from the trail. To her and her boy, it tasted like salvation. When the child slept, the woman finally found the courage to ask, "Why did you stop? Why help us?" The cowboy poked at the fire with a stick. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then he said, his voice low, "Because I've seen too many left to die. Couldn't ride past one more." There was pain in his words, a shadow that told of someone he had lost. She didn't ask who. She didn't need to. She only whispered, "Thank you." For the first time, his eyes met hers. He gave a small nod, but his gaze burned with something unspoken, something buried deep in the past. The test of the desert. The desert was not done testing them. On the third day, a storm rose suddenly, sweeping across the sands in a furious howl. The horse reared, the boy cried, and the woman clung desperately to the saddle. The cowboy's arms wrapped around them both, his voice steady as he shouted above the wind, "Hold tight!" Sand tore at their faces, choking the air, turning the world into a whirl of dust and fury. But the cowboy guided them through, his grip unyielding, his will as relentless as the storm itself. When at last the winds died, they collapsed in the shelter of a canyon wall. The woman trembled. Her child clutched close. The cowboy knelt beside them, his own body battered by the storm, but his eyes calm. "You're safe now," he said, as if it were a promise carved in stone. The towns. Eyes at last, after days of hardship, the lights of a town appeared in the distance. To the woman, it looked like heaven, but when they rode into its dusty streets, the stares of the townsfolk told another story. Whispers followed them, words sharp as knives. Beggar. Burden. Why's he bothering with the likes of her? The woman lowered her eyes, in shame, but the cowboy rode tall, ignoring them all. He took her straight to the doctor, demanding care for the child. The boy was examined, fed, given medicine. When the doctor declared he would live, relief washed over her like rain on parched earth. The townsfolk, seeing her child alive, began to murmur. Shame spread through them. They had ignored her once, left her to the desert. But a stranger, a man they barely trusted, had shown more humanity than all of them combined. The last whisper. That night, the boy slept safe in a real bed, his breathing steady. The woman stepped outside, searching for the cowboy. She found him near the edge of town, saddling his horse under the pale glow of the moon. "You're leaving," she said softly. He didn't look at her. Never planned to stay. She wanted to beg him to remain, to tell him he wasn't just a savior, but the only reason her heart still beat. But the words caught in her throat. The cowboy swung into the saddle. For a moment he paused, his hat low over his eyes. Then he spoke the words that had saved her in the desert, the words that would echo in her soul forever. "You're not alone." And then he was gone. a shadow disappearing into the night, leaving behind a memory carved into her very bones. The desert showed no mercy. The woman's skin burned under the endless sun, her lips cracked into bloodied lines, her child limp against her shoulder. She had wandered for 2 days and nights, chasing a promise of water that never appeared. Each step dragged her closer to collapse. The boy's breaths grew shallow, his tiny chest rising like a flicker of flame about to vanish. She pressed her face to his hair, whispering broken prayers. She no longer knew if she prayed for salvation or for the strength to die holding him. All around her stretched the wasteland. The wind carried the hiss of death. Vultures circled in silent hunger, and the horizon blurred like a mirage mocking her. She staggered forward anyway. A mother's love was a stubborn thing. Even in the jaws of hell, she refused to stop. But her body betrayed her. Her knees buckled. The child slipped from her arms. She gathered him up again, crawling across the burning ground. She thought she heard laughter in the wind, voices of ghosts who had perished in the sands before her. She thought she saw shapes, moving, men, horses, though she knew no one was there. Until suddenly, someone was. The stranger's shadow. The ground trembled faintly. At first, she mistook it for her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, but then it grew, steady, rhythmic. Hooves, through the haze of heat and tears, she saw him. A lone rider on a dark horse, cresting the dune like some spirit called from the old stories. The sun painted fire along the brim of his hat, and his coat whipped like a shadow in the wind. She blinked, certain he was a mirage. But the horse slowed. The man dismounted. Boots crunched against sand as he strode toward her. She wanted to scream, to beg, but no sound came. Only her trembling hand lifted, a wordless plea. The cowboy crouched. His face was roughened by sun and dust, his jaw marked by old scars. But his eyes, sharp, steady, saw her, truly saw her. He looked from her hollow cheeks to the child nearly gone in her arms. Then his voice, deep, low, steady as the earth, cut through her delirium. "You're not alone. The rescue." He moved quickly. A canteen appeared in his hand. He tipped water to her lips, controlling her sips with a patience that steadied her panicked gasps. Then he pressed droplets to the boy's mouth, coaxing the child's eyes to flutter open. "You're safe now," he said, though she did not believe it. He wrapped his coat around them both. With surprising gentleness, he lifted her and her boy into his saddle. Then he mounted behind them, his arms strong and protective as he clicked the reins. The horse moved. The desert began to pass beneath them, each stride carrying them away from death. The woman tried to speak, to ask his name, but exhaustion claimed her. Her head fell against his chest, where his heartbeat thudded steady and strong, like a drum guiding her back to life. Firelight confessions. When she woke again, it was to the crackle of firelight. She lay on a blanket beneath a sky of burning stars. The cowboy sat across from her, sharpening a knife, his expression carved from stone. Her boy slept beside her, his lips less pale now. A tin plate weighted with beans and bread. She ate, each bite shaking in her hand, and finally whispered, Why? Help us!" The cowboy's gaze lifted slowly. For a moment he said nothing. Then, voice roughened by memory, he answered, "Because once I didn't." The fire popped. Shadows danced across his face, revealing pain buried deep. He didn't explain further, but she understood. Whoever he had failed, he carried them, still. And perhaps saving her was his way of fighting ghosts. She lowered her head. For the first time since the desert swallowed her, she felt tears. Tears not of despair, but of fragile hope. The storm's trial. The desert wasn't finished testing them. By the next afternoon, clouds roared across the horizon. Winds whipped sand into a furious storm. The horse screamed. The boy clung to his mother. The cowboy pulled them close, his voice thundering against the gale. "Hold on!" Sand lashed their skin, turning the world into a blinding fury. The woman buried her face against him, her boy shielded by his arms. His body was the barrier between them and the storm, his strength their anchor. Hours later, when the winds died, they emerged battered but alive. She looked at him with awe. This stranger who had not hesitated to give his very flesh against the desert's wrath. "You're safe now," he repeated, and somehow she believed him. The town's judgment at last. Lights shimmered on the horizon. A town, civilization, salvation. But salvation was cruel. When they entered, the townsfolk stared. Women whispered, men spat. They saw not a mother saved from death, but a burden carried by a man who owed her nothing. "Why'd he bring her here?" someone muttered. "She ain't his kin. She'll drain him dry." The woman lowered her gaze, shame pressing heavier than the sun ever had. But the cowboy rode tall, unshaken. He ignored every word, steering straight to the doctor's office. The child was treated, fed, declared strong enough to live. Relief swept through her like rain. The townsfolk's whispers grew quieter. They saw the boy's life returning, and shame curled in their bellies. They had turned their eyes from her suffering. A stranger had not. The goodbye that night, she searched for him. She found him at the edge of town, his horse saddled, the moon silvering his hat. "You're leaving?" she whispered. He didn't meet her eyes. "I ain't one to stay." Her throat tightened. She wanted to beg him to remain, but she saw the weight he carried, the loneliness etched into him. He was a man who belonged to the road, not to walls. He swung into the saddle. For a heartbeat, he hesitated. Then he looked down at her, and his voice softened with the same words that had saved her in the desert. "You're not alone." And then he was gone, swallowed by moonlight and silence, leaving behind a memory carved into her soul. A memory she would tell her boy when he was grown, so he'd know the truth. That in the darkest place, when hope had died, a stranger came, and with 4 words, he gave them life again.